Chapter 1. Detective Amanda Barnes thought she'd seen everything that the small town of Prowler's Bluff, Colorado had to offer, and it wasn't much. Towny for life. She'd grown up in the tiny mountain-hugged pocket of Prowler's Bluff, and had been one of its detectives for a year, one of its 5 detectives, and one of only 20 individuals on the entire police force, because Prowler's Bluff was that kind of town. In olden times they would have called it a one-horse town. Presently it was a one-main street town, and there wasn't even a Walmart for 20 miles. Serene, picturesque, with a tight-knit community of people whose families had lived in that exact spot for generations, Prowler's Bluff was not a high-crime area. Some theft, defacement of property on occasion, and in the last year a few wolf sightings, but never any attacks. There was public drunkenness on a Saturday night and assault when tempers ran too hot in the high altitude, but generally Prowler's Bluff was not a hotbed of criminal activity, certainly not of murder. But this was some silence of the lamb shit, and Amanda was not prepared for it. She'd barely finished her morning cup of coffee, getting through the tedious paperwork of a car accident the day before, when the call came in. Officer Andy Rottler had sounded so panicked over dispatch that Elaine, who worked the desk, had just handed him over to Amanda. Apparently Andy had stopped into the Quick Mart to fill up the tank of his cruiser and grab a bag of Funyuns, when he'd found poor Mr. Stanley in the same state that Amanda was observing. Now, Mr. Stanley, an odd old bird in his late 50s, had owned the town's only gas station and Quick Mart for some 20 years. He kept to himself, had a cabin up on the mountain off the town grid, and was a generally pleasant if unsocial person, always with a have a nice day when Amanda stopped in or a wave if she was just driving past. And now here Mr. Stanley was in the back office of the Quick Mart, splayed out on the floor and skinned like a jackrabbit for supper. Amanda had never seen anything like it outside of a horror movie. The entire PBDP had gathered at the Quick Mart when they heard all 10 cop cars were crowding its parking lot, along with a few personal rides including Amanda's motorcycle, which, once she'd made detective, she preferred to drive instead of one of the sedans. Captain Martin was standing beside her, staring down at Mr. Stanley with a look of horrified bewilderment on his face. He reached over and got an arm around Amanda, hugging her close for a second like a protective father. "This is the damnedest thing I ever seen," he murmured, looking a bit sick as he let her go. "Nobody local could have done this," Amanda said, stepping back. But her eyes were glued to the corpse. "And where's the not on the scene?" Judd Peterson, the local me, arrived on Captain Martin's other side, staring grimly down at Mr. Stanley as well. He scratched thoughtfully at his long gray beard. "Whoever did this took the skin." Barry Sims, Peterson's brand new assistant, went scuttling over to the corpse to begin his examination. Amanda grimaced and looked away from the corpse. "Well, get him out of here so that we can go over the scene for anything the killer might have left behind. There has to be a fingerprint or something. You can't just skin a man whole and get away clean." Peterson nodded and turned to wave his assistant forward with the gurney. Amanda turned away as they gathered up what was left of Mr. Stanley, pacing over to the Quick Mart's front doors. She stared through the glass at the parking lot, at the mountains that ring the small town, clutching at Prowler's Bluff like a giant's hand. "I want you to take point on this," Captain Martin said. Amanda looked at him, frowning. "Me? Why me?" "Amanda, if we don't find who did this quickly, I'll be forced to call in the feds," the captain sighed. "I don't want to do that. Nobody in this town wants me to do that. You may be the youngest detective on the force, but Hanson and Felix can't handle this kind of shit. They're still sitting out in their squad car." Amanda frowned. "Fine, but and your new partner?" Amanda's frown turned into a surprised scowl. "Wait, my what?" Captain Martin hauled in a deep breath, dark eyes meeting Amanda's when she looked into his face and smiled. Amanda did not like the shape of that smile. "You're a detective, Barnes. You need a partner. We got a transfer in. He'll be meeting you at the station." "Someone transferred here?" The captain nodded. "From Denver. Before that, Chicago. He's got good references. His superiors all said he'd do better in a small town. He asked to come here, and with his experience he could have gone anywhere." "That sounds like bullshit to me," Amanda muttered, looking away. Captain Martin sighed out a deep breath. "Look, maybe he's dealt with something like this before. We sure as shit haven't. We'll use all the help we can get. Well, I'm going up to Stanley's cabin, Amanda decided. You need to go to the station and get your partner. I don't want to go get him. You call him and tell him to meet me at Stanley's cabin. You think that's a good way to start a partnership? Amanda shoved open the Quick Mart door with a glance over her shoulder at the captain and scoffed. I don't need or want a partner, Captain, and you can force me to have one, but you can't force me to like it. The little bell above the Quick Mart's door chimed meaningfully as Amanda let it swing shut. She pulled the aviators from the collar of her t-shirt and slid them on as she walked to her bike. She took her helmet and settled it snugly over her short, dark hair, climbing onto the bike as she flipped her visor down, with a honk at the squad car where Hanson and Felix were still huddling. Away from the crime scene, she drove her bike out of the parking lot and onto the wide highway that led up the mountain, deep into the woods that fleeced its peak. It wasn't that having a partner bothered Amanda. She'd known that it was only a matter of time. Protocol demanded that detectives work in pairs. But she'd been on her own since passing the detective's exam, and she'd gotten comfortable. Moreover, she hadn't ever thought that her partner, the person she was supposed to trust with her life, would be someone from out of town. Like anyone who'd grown up in a small town and never left it, Amanda was not good with strangers. She liked to think of herself as more open-minded than the average townie, but the truth was she didn't like change. When she was younger, she'd had dreams of leaving Prowler's Bluff and going to college, making a life somewhere else, but then her parents had died in the worst flash flood the Bluff had seen in decades. Amanda never thought about leaving again. Instead, she got her BA in criminology online and joined the force, wanting to help people. She wasn't stupid or naive. She knew how narrow-minded other people could be in their view of small towns, and she did not look forward to having to defend Prowler's Bluff to this new hotshot detective. He would call it backwards. Backwater, call the townspeople bumpkins and hicks. And maybe they were. In fact, most of them definitely were, but they were part of her home, and Amanda felt like it was being invaded. And she was on the front line. As she drove her motorcycle up into the mountains, her ears popping as the air thinned further, she thought about her new partner instead of poor Mr. Stanley. Or who might have killed him. The idea that there was a violent killer in her small town was even less frightening than the idea of her annoying new partner. Mr. Stanley's house was tucked off the main highway, half a mile into the deep woods. These roads were old and unpaved, hard to navigate if you weren't familiar with the area. They were mostly old trapper trails left over from the turn of the 20th century, used primarily by hunters in modern days. But hunting season was past and the paths were beginning to overgrow with foliage, clogging the way up the mountain. Amanda had to park her bike only a little ways off the highway and leave it, continuing into the forest on foot. Morning sunlight dappled the gnarled roots and crunching leaves that blanketed the trail into the forest, and Amanda followed the well-worn path. She was no stranger to the forest, even if she had never been up this far before. The quiet of the sentinel trees overhead did not bother her, nor did the occasional chirp or cry of the wilderness all around her. Her feet were sure, despite the unpaved ground underfoot. As she got deeper into the forest and the sunlight began to thin between the tree branches and leaves above, she pulled the aviators from her eyes and hooked them into the collar of her shirt again, hiking her way up the trail in the cooler mountain shade. Mr. Stanley's house blended so well into its surroundings that she almost missed it. Most of the cabins this far up were self-sufficient homes, and their residents had gone out of their way to make them modern, but Mr. Stanley's house was basically just a shack. It was tucked up against a gigantic oak tree, its roof slanted beneath a jut of mountain rock. It was easily 100 years old, if not more, and there was a wooden gate around a small front yard that doubled as a garden, though the gate itself was dilapidated and falling apart. The garden thrived in spite of that, though, and Amanda couldn't help but wonder how Mr. Stanley had kept the woodland animals from eating all of his fresh vegetables. She nudged open the gate's door, which made a loud groaning noise on its hinges, and walked up the cobblestone path to the little cabin's front door. When she tried the knob, she found that it was locked, so with a sigh she pulled her lock-picking kit from the pocket of her leather jacket and sank into a crouch in front of the door. Lockpicking had not been a part of her criminology coursework, but before she was a cop she'd been a rambunctious teenager with a penchant for troublemaking. Those days were behind her, but some of the skills remained and came in handy on occasion. It only took her a few minutes to pop the crude lock on Mr. Stanley's front door. She swung it wide and slipped inside, closing it at her back, and was plunged into sharp-smelling darkness. There weren't any windows at all. She fumbled a hand along the wall beside the door for a light switch but found none. After bumping into at least one table, she pulled the small utility flashlight from her belt and clicked it on, sweeping its pale light all around the cabin's interior. Then she knew what was causing that smell. Half a dozen animal carcasses were hanging from the ceiling in various states of preservation. Amanda didn't balk as some might have. She knew what the inside of a hunter's cabin could look like. A few rabbits and a buck had been skinned and left to cure, and huddled around them were bunches of herbs and dangling branches. Though it looked like the inside of an evil witch's home, it was more likely that Mr. Stanley grew and hunted his own food, skipping the convenience of even his own Quick Mart. In a corner of the room, Amanda found a gas lamp and set down her flashlight in favor of the box of matches beside it. Once lit, the warm light of the lamp cast the cabin's interior in gentler tones, and Amanda saw a wood stove at the other end of the room along with a small cot, a comfortable armchair and a transistor radio. Mr. Stanley had been, it seemed, a very simple man. Amanda couldn't think of a single reason why anyone would want to murder him, let alone so violently. She paused by the armchair, looking around at the hardwood floors. They were very clean, save that there seemed to be an abundance of animal fur. Amanda saw no food bowls, no indication of a cat or dog, and the carcasses strung up for meat were naked of skin and fur. She bent down, pulling a latex glove from her jacket pocket with every intention of taking some of the hair back to the lab for identification, but before she swept any of it up, she heard the exterior gate groan again outside. She turned on her heels towards the door, tucking the glove back into her pocket, her hand instinctively landing on the sidearm holstered on her belt. The front door swung open and she straightened back to her full height as a broad-shouldered silhouette filled the entryway. He had to duck a little to get through the cabin door, he was so tall. As the light from the gas lamp swept over him, Amanda felt a breath hitch in her chest. He was gorgeous. Long lines and roping muscles were bound by a brown bomber jacket, and thick black hair was swept back from his face. His jaw was so chiseled Amanda was pretty sure she could have cut diamonds on it, shadowed by a few days of beard. When his dark brown eyes landed on her, she shivered a little in spite of herself. "Detective Barnes?" he asked, arching an eyebrow. "Yes." She let go of her sidearm and unclipped her badge from her belt, holding it up for him to see. He sniffed at the air and prowled deeper into the cabin. Felt suddenly very, very small with him inside, and much, much hotter than it had been when Amanda arrived. "Who are you?" "Jake Hunter." He lifted a badge as well, the shield catching the lamplight with a flicker. "Your new partner." Amanda's heart did a little flip-flop. How was she supposed to hate someone this freaking good-looking? "Nice to meet you," she stammered, blushing as she caught herself giving him a once-over. Apparently, he caught her as well, because a beautiful smirk lit across his mouth and he propped his hands on his hips, easing the wings of his jacket back to give her a better view of how his black t-shirt hugged the ripples of his abdomen. Her blush brightened and she looked away. "Don't worry," he said. "I don't fuck locals." Her eyes snapped back to him at that, eyebrows rocking upward. "Excuse me. You're cute and all but not my type." She gaped at him then. "Well, you're not my type. You'd climb me like a tree," he laughed. "EW, who talks to people like that?" "Look, I'm here to solve a murder." He shrugged. "Not my fault if you get wet. Just looking at me." Amanda felt a strong urge to shoot him, but she just shook her head and decided it was better to just ignore him as best she could. What a dick. All of her worst expectations of this whole new partner thing were being confirmed. This fucking guy was going to be the worst thing that ever happened to her. She clipped her badge back onto her belt and pulled the glove from her pocket, dropping back down to swipe up some of the hair off the floor. "What are you doing?" he asked sharply. "Collecting evidence. You know, like detectives do." "I'll take that." He paced over to her, ducking around a hanging rabbit carcass, and held out his hand. She glared at him. "I got it. Thanks." "Give it to me." he insisted. You backwater cops always fuck up evidence collection. I'll make sure it gets to the lab intact. Go fuck yourself, she said, pocketing the hair in the glove. She moved to go around him towards the front door, but he took one big step to the side and blocked her path. You don't want to get on my bad side, sugar, he growled. She squared her shoulders. I don't really give a shit about your bad side. Or your good side, if you even have one. I'm doing my job and you're getting in the way just like I knew you would. Now move so I can go back to the station. She saw surprise flicker across his face. He probably wasn't used to dealing with women who stood up for themselves, and certainly not any who stood up to him. Then his sharp, dark eyebrows swept downward and she thought he was going to insist again, but there was a sudden noise from the garden outside. Growling. The unmistakable growl of a predator on the hunt. Her hand went to her sidearm and she shoved past Jake to get to the front door. When she opened it, to her amazement, she found a pack of at least 7 wolves milling about in Mr. Stanley's garden. She slammed the door shut. Holy shit, it's a pack of wolves, she gasped, looking wide-eyed back at Jake. He had his arms crossed over his chest, not at all worried about this new turn of events. In fact, Amanda thought he looked a little smug. Well, if there are wolves, you shouldn't go out there, he pointed out. Amanda frowned, pulling her sidearm from its holster. I'm not just going to stay in here with you for God knows how long. Jake laughed, the sound dark and resonating. I'm good with animals, he told her, walking forward. He got closer, too close she might have said, except that she found herself particularly fond of his scent. She inhaled and realized that he stopped only inches away. He looked down at her, dark eyes sparkling amusedly. I'll get rid of the wolves if you give me the evidence. She tried to scoff, but it got stuck in her throat. How will you get rid of them? I won't hurt them, he assured her. Amanda thought that sounded ludicrous, that this guy could get rid of a whole wolf pack on his own. It was also ludicrous that a wolf pack would be prowling around outside during the day like this, gathered together in an old man's front yard. But something in her gut told her that Jake could handle the animals and that there was something else going on here. And Amanda always listened to her gut. With a sigh, she pulled the glove and the hair from her pocket and slammed it down into his palm. He made a fist, shoved it into the front pocket of his tight-fitting jeans and flashed her some white teeth. Be right back, he said, reaching past her to tug open the door again. She moved and he slipped around her, closing the door behind him. She put her ear to the door, wanting to know what he did but having no window through which to watch him work. At first all she could hear was the sound of his boots on the cobblestone walkway, and then she could hear the growling. Again. The sound swelled until it was a chorus of indecipherable animal sounds, all dangerous, until there was one apart from the others that sounded less animal, more human. Was Jake just standing out there growling back at them? Amanda could have kicked herself for being so stupid, for believing he could just handle a pack of wolves. What an idiot. He was going to get himself killed like other attractive men used to getting their own way. The wilderness of the mountain didn't care that he was confident and hot. It would eat him alive just like anyone else. Gritting her teeth, Amanda pulled her sidearm from its holster again and grabbed the door, yanking it open. She burst out of the house, firearm raised, but as soon as her eyes adjusted to the sunlight, she realized the wolf pack was gone. What the hell? Jake was standing with his hands in his pockets, surveying the garden. He half turned to look at her and smirked. Told you I'd handle it. What did you do? She holstered her sidearm and tromped down the walkway, brushing past him to exit the garden and head back down the path. I'll have crime scene go over the cabin, but there's nothing in there that'll tell us who killed Mr. Stanley. I reasoned with them, Jake quipped, shrugging his broad shoulders as he fell into step behind Amanda. And it was probably just a freak thing. A drifter. Want to take a look at the body? Why? Amanda frowned some more. He was skinned. That's the cause of death. Because I'm a fucking detective, Jake snapped. His tone of voice got so sharp so suddenly that Amanda looked over at him, taken aback. He was scowling at her. So I'm going to do my job and look at the damn body. Fine, she snapped back. Jesus. Calm down. He seemed to take a moment, breathing in and then out, and looked away from her with a grunt. I'm fine. She didn't believe him. There was a vein standing out from his throat, and he was flushed with the effort of controlling himself. Amanda had never seen a man so close to losing his temper so quickly. And over what? Her mind started turning all over again. How had he found Mr. Stanley's house so easily and quickly without ever having been there before? Why was he so determined to be the one to handle the evidence? And who in their right mind would want to see the skinned corpse of a man? What further evidence did he think he'd find that the me wouldn't? A cold lance of dread sliced right through Amanda to her guts. What if he wasn't looking for evidence to use to find the killer? What if he was looking for evidence to cover up? Was it a coincidence that her new partner's first day was the same day that the most grisly murder in 20 years occurred in Prowler's Bluff? Amanda felt the hairs on the back of her neck prickle. What is it? She looked up and realized that Jake was staring at her. His expression was hard, unreadable, his dark eyes nearly black in the bright sunlight spotting the forest floor through the trees. Nothing, she said. You had a look on your face like you were scared. She shook her head and looked away. Nope, not scared. Totally fine. Except for his looming figure beside her, that is. She told herself not to get swept up in paranoid thinking. Maybe the captain had given Jake really good directions to Mr. Stanley's cabin. Maybe Jake had a map in his car. It might actually all be coincidence. But it might not. She needed to dig into his history, find out more about him. She didn't think she'd get very far by asking. He was such a prick he'd probably just lie. They walked the rest of the way back down to the highway in silence. Amanda couldn't help but notice how sure-footed Jake was the entire way, never stumbling or pausing to think which direction to go. He wasn't even really following her, just matching her strides and her pace, confident in where he was even though he'd never been there before. It had taken her years to learn these woods once she'd gotten brave enough to actually hike the mountain. He walked like he'd been born in them. That didn't sit right with her, along with many other things about him. Finally, Amanda could hear the quiet zoom of the highway beyond the trees. Shortly after that, she spotted her bike right where she'd left it. A navy blue Buick, one of the station's undercover cars, was parked beside her motorcycle. Jake fished the keys out of his jacket pocket. I like your bike, he said. She tried not to roll her eyes. Yeah, I'll see you back at the station. She didn't look at him again, just went to her bike and pulled on her helmet. But she could feel him staring at her the whole time. It freaked her out as much as it turned her on just thinking about him looking at her. She hated to admit it, even just to herself, but she was incredibly attracted to him. She couldn't help but flush at the thought of his body, his hands, his eyes. She gunned the bike's engine just to hear it roar, to listen to something other than her own stupid thoughts, and drove back onto the main road before Jake had even gotten into the sedan. Chapter 2. When he got back to the station, Detective Jake Hunter stopped by the ME's office. He'd get the go-ahead to head to the county morgue attached to the hospital, which was almost as much a shack as Stanley's cabin. Fucking small towns. Jake hated small towns. Really, he hated all towns, but small ones were the worst because they didn't have the peace and quiet of being in the middle of nowhere or the anonymity of a big city. It was the worst of all possible worlds, but here he was, small town USA. Population nobody except for one crazy murderer and one hot lady cop who was already more distracting than he could handle. He was here for a reason, and he hadn't expected to get saddled with a partner, let alone a pretty one with brains who was going to get in his way. Even worse, she was going to get into his head. He had to focus on something other than how cute her ass looked when she climbed onto that motorcycle, or what it might have been like to ride her instead. Focus, Jake. Focus. He dropped off the keys to the undercover car with Felix at the front desk and got waylaid by Captain Martin, who steered him into the bullpen to meet everyone. He endured the protocol, the handshakes, the smiles and welcomes, knowing that he'd never remember any of these people. He wouldn't even try. He caught a glimpse of Detective Barnes at her desk, then saw her leave again, without even looking at him. Probably for the best. She wasn't even his type. Jake went for skinny blondes with no inhibitions or self-esteem, picking them up in local bars and fucking them in the bathroom between rounds of shots. He didn't have time for women who had an opinion. He didn't have time for women who wanted more. He didn't have much to offer those women, so he didn't bother. Amanda Barnes was a different story altogether. Petite and curvy with full hips and a generous bust. She had piercing blue eyes beneath a sexy fall of sleek dark brown hair, cut in a jagged bob across her chin. She was all soft, feminine looks, but then there was that sharp intellect. She was going to be a problem if she got too nosy. Jake did not like problems. They pissed him off, and he had never been very good at controlling his temper. He made the rounds and introduced himself to everyone, then managed to detach from Captain Martin and head downstairs to the basement where the medical examiner's office was located. Just his luck, the me was out to lunch and so was his assistant. Jake moved deeper into the office though until he found a computer and some filing cabinets, then he started rummaging until he found the forms he'd need to get signed so he could see the body at the morgue. Without the ME's signature, they might not let him in, but Jake was going to give it his best shot. Most of the time, people weren't interested in getting in his way, proper paperwork or not. If the coroner was a man, he'd intimidate him out of the way. If it was a woman, he'd seduce her out of the way. Either way, he was going to get a good look and a sniff at that body. He was already mostly sure. He knew why the man was dead, but he still didn't know who or how. He hadn't come all this way for nothing, he told himself. He was going to solve this fucking case. He drove his rental to the hospital instead of the undercover car. While both cars were a piece of shit, at least the rental had some clutch left to it, and it was a Jeep, good for going off-road in the mountains just in case. It was far more practical than the department's navy blue Buick, but not as practical as Barnes' motorcycle, which was already parked at the damn hospital. Son of a bitch. She'd beaten him there. After the look she'd given him for wanting to see the body, the last place he expected her to go was the morgue. And the little bitch had come without telling him, knowing he wanted to get in to see the corpse. He didn't like that one bit. That reeked of suspicion, and the last thing he needed was a stupid bumpkin partner gumming up the works. He parked the Jeep right next to her bike and strode up the walkway, pushing open the glass door, running a hand back through his hair to sweep it out of his eyes. Small hospitals had to have a morgue, of course, but they liked to keep it as far out of sight as possible. Even without the very quiet signage proclaiming where he was, Jake would have known he was in a morgue immediately, both from the smell, the sharp odor of clean things, and because it was so damn cold inside. He bypassed the front desk altogether, and the receptionist let him, assuming he was supposed to be there just from his attitude. That happened a lot, and he took full advantage of it. People didn't want to get in his way almost as much as he didn't want them in his way. He tipped his head up and inhaled deeply, taking the smell of his place right into his nose. He managed to parse through the clean smells towards the sweet funk of death underneath, and then something fresh and unexpected interrupted. Summer sunlight in crisp mountain evenings, wildflowers, and the subtle glance of lavender soap. Amanda. He turned a corner and followed the scent down a corridor through a pair of swinging double doors. There was the cadaver bank, where the mouse-faced coroner with a thin mustache and Amanda looked down at a corpse pulled out of its drawer. They looked up from the body as Jake approached. "Nice of you to offer me a ride," he all but growled at Amanda. She frowned. "Figured you could find it on your own easy enough." "So I did. What do we got, Doc?" The coroner flinched a little back from the body, holding up a small, pale hand. Subject was found DOA. Cause of death was loss of blood. He bled out while the killer skinned him alive," Amanda finished, folding her arms beneath the full curves of her breasts. "Which I told you already." Jake ignored her, going to the slab's edge. He looked down at the exposed figure of Mr. Stanley, all skinless muscle and bone. It was disgusting, but it didn't bother him. The scent of flesh never did, even the rotten kind, because at least it was natural. The state of the body bothered him though, and he felt his temper start to simmer in the back of his mind like a waking beast. The other scents on the body were more difficult to navigate. Some animal, some man. He couldn't pull one scent out of the rest to identify the killer. Just a lot of muscle and blood and bone and what was left of Mr. Stanley. "Show me the incision mark on the back," he told the coroner, who blinked widely and looked up at him in alarm, then looked sharply at Amanda. After she gave a little nod, the coroner reached up and grasped Stanley's shoulder with gloved hands, rolling the corpse onto its side so that Jake could see the back. There, in the same place it always was, right at the base of the spine, was the first cut the killer used to get under the skin. Jake nodded, and the Coroner rolled the corpse back down. I'm sorry, detectives, but I have a lot of work to do. Will that be all? Jake stepped back from the slab and tucked his hands, curled into tight fists, into the pockets of his bomber jacket. I'm done. Me too, Amanda said, nodding. The coroner slid Mr. Stanley back into his fridge, clamping and locking the compartment, and before he was even finished, Amanda was walking away. She didn't say a thing, she just started walking. Jake frowned and went after her. Long strides eating up the distance between them quickly, until he was at her side. How did you get the coroner to show you the body without paperwork from the me? He asked. I've known Bob since I was 6. She shrugged. He knows I'm good for paperwork. And you didn't tell me you were coming here because... She let out a delicate little snort. You seem to want to do things on your own, Hunter. I was just trying to oblige. Her tone pissed him off. He couldn't tell if he wanted to smack her or shove her up against the wall and kiss her, but both were problematic. I want to catch this murderer as much as you do, he said, trying to keep his voice even. Yeah, I'm sure you do. He couldn't read her tone, but he was pretty sure that meant he wouldn't like it if he could. And her body language, well, he could read that easily enough. High shoulders and eyes straight ahead, arms still crossed. She was defensive. Maybe he shouldn't have been so cavalier with his comments earlier in Stanley's cabin. He'd expected her to be a stupid bimbo like the usual women he dealt with. That had been a mistake and he regretted it now. But she had been checking him out, he was sure enough of that. Every woman checked him out. But he didn't usually have to work a case with them, and that was messing him up. Maybe he should have just fucked her right away and established that right off, taking dominance in the form of sexual conquest. Then maybe he wouldn't feel so undermined by her. Maybe it wouldn't have bothered him so much that she could undermine him at all. Most people couldn't. She seemed naturally predisposed to ignore his looks, and he had no real charm to lean on instead. Oh fuck this, he thought. He had shit to do. I'm going to go take a look at the crime scene, he said. I haven't been over there yet. She nodded. Okay. What are you going to do? Paperwork. Back at the station. Some research into this kind of thing elsewhere. In the country. Well then I'll see you there. Probably not. She shouldered open the glass door and walked out into the parking lot, heading for her bike. I'll only be there an hour or two then. I'm taking the rest of the afternoon off. You can just do that? Sure. You can get my cell number from dispatch if you need me. This woman was infuriating. Jake couldn't tell what was pissing him off more. The idea that he'd been stuck with her as a partner when he didn't want a damn partner, or the idea that she, his partner, wasn't even going to help him. What kind of a cop was she? A shitty one, a shitty little girl playing at cop. Not a detective at all. Maybe she was fucking the captain and that's how she'd gotten her shield so young. That sort of shit never happened in big cities or even in the really rural areas where cops had more ground to cover. That was some real small town bullshit. Fine, he said to her back, even as she was climbing onto her motorcycle. He got to his Jeep, slamming the door shut once he was in the driver's seat. The sound of her motorcycle roaring and then zipping off into the distance set his teeth on edge. Focus, Jake. The sooner he got to the bottom of this, the sooner he could get the hell out of Prowler's Bluff. Chapter 3. Amanda went right back to the station, waving off all the questions everyone shot her way as she passed through the bullpen. All they wanted to know about was Jake Hunter. Where's he from? Is he married? What's he like? Apparently he hadn't made much of an impression when he passed through earlier. Amanda just shrugged and did her best to look moody, which kept everyone except Elaine away. When they pressed, she reminded them of the dead-skinned body she'd just been to visit, and then the stragglers backed off as well. Hanson and Felix retreated swiftly to their own desks, glad that she seemed to have taken the reins of the case. Though they were the senior detectives, they didn't have the stomach for this kind of thing. Neither admittedly did Amanda, but someone had to stand up around here. Captain Martin had known that it would be her. But poor Mr. Stanley wasn't even first on Amanda's mind. She had questions of her own about Detective Jake Hunter, and she needed answers before she could do anything else. She shoved paperwork and empty coffee cups aside to get to the keyboard of a near-ancient machine, but it was the only one that would let her into the system. It took an agonizing 10 minutes to even boot up, and Amanda Couldn't even count how many times she'd begged Captain Martin to upgrade the computers. Eventually, she got into the database and then into Captain Martin's email. Not that he knew she could do that, but she never abused it. She started going through all the emails she could find that had anything to do with Jake Hunter's transfer from Denver, and before that Chicago, and before that Atlanta, and before that Houston. All of his references were glowing, but he'd never spent more than a few months in any one precinct in any one city in the last 5 years. She couldn't even find a place of birth for him or a permanent adresse. He had something like 5 P.O. boxes all across the country. He'd gone to the police academy in some town in Iowa that Amanda had never heard of and didn't bother looking for on a map. It could have all been bullshit, she reasoned, made up to make him look legitimate. Or it could have all been quite real and still as convoluted as it seemed. She was getting nowhere. She exited Captain Martin's email and instead pulled up the crime database so she could search for similar murders, see if there was anything that might be similar to Mr. Stanley's rather extraordinary demise. In order to get access, though, she had to put in a request that could take up to 24 hours to be cleared, another antiquated system seemingly designed to cock up her attempts at getting things done. She thought about going back to the crime scene as well, but didn't feel like dealing with Jake. She thought about going back to Stanley's cabin too, but the memory of the wolf pack gave her pause. They'd been spotted roaming the mountain here and there, but never all together and never so close to humans. That made her nervous. Instead, she called the forensics guy. There was only one Tom to see if Jake had dropped off the hairs she'd found for analysis, but of course he hadn't. Frustrated and at ends, she decided to get out of the station and drive around town a bit, ask some of the locals what they knew about Mr. Stanley, who he hung around with, if he had any friends or enemies or any acquaintances at all. She took down Jake's cell phone number from Elaine just in case. In case of what? She wasn't sure. But she plugged it into her phone under Jake Dickhead and felt some satisfaction there. It took her the better part of the afternoon, but she determined that Mr. Stanley basically had no friends at all, which was more or less what she'd expected. He was an older man, single, who owned a gas station and convenience shop. Old Cal, the bartender at Benson's, the deviest of local dives, said that Mr. Stanley had only ever come in once or twice in the decades that he'd owned the Quick Mart. He didn't spend time at the bar like the other men of his generation in town. He never came to town meetings. The clerk at the town hall said he'd signed in once in the past 6 months. He was just a lonely old hermit who lived on a mountain and owned a Quick Mart to pay for the mortgage still out on his land. There wasn't a single reason Amanda could find why anyone would want to kill him. The register had even been full of cash. Both times, Cal had told her as he wiped down the counter with a spotted rag. He came in to watch the World Series. Guy was a Mets fan. Here. Amanda squinted at him. Cal shrugged, slinging the rag over one wide shoulder. Didn't really say anything either, just sat and drank his beer and watched the game, then left. Is it true what they're saying? Somebody skinned him. Amanda winced. She knew that anything she said would spread across town like wildfire, but it was going to come out sooner or later. It would either come from her, or from Felix or Hudson when they went home to their respective wives and told them how freaky seeing the body had been. Then their wives would tell their neighbors and their book club members and the clerks at the grocery store, or Captain Martin would make some kind of announcement which would just blow everything out of proportion. As though he could read all this on her face, Cal set a shot of whiskey down on the counter in front of Amanda. I'm on duty, she sighed. Cal checked his watch. Not according to my clock, sweetheart. Take a load off. Amanda hesitated, but it had been a hell of a day. As she leaned forward to take a seat on one of the bar stools, her phone went off. She ignored the shot glass and fished it free of her jacket pocket, looking down to find a text from Captain Martin. Second body found, Strico. Amanda sighed and stepped back from the bar. Rain check, Cal. Okay. The old bartender nodded, smiling knowingly. Good luck, Amanda. Amanda turned on a heel to exit the bar and head for her bike, but as she got out to the curb where she'd parked her motorcycle, she came up short to find Jake leaning against his Jeep right next to it. She frowned, pausing a few feet away, hands stuffed into her jacket pockets, and watched him look up from his phone and straighten out of his lean. Got Martin's text too? He asked. Yeah, obviously. What's a Strico? Strickland County. That's 2 counties over, about an hour away. The killer is moving. Jake nodded and gave his truck a pat. Get in. I'll drive. Amanda balked. No thanks. I'll take my bike. Jake looked up sharply, dark eyes narrowing slightly on her. You've been drinking, detective. Get your fucking ass in the truck. How did you even know I was here? She demanded. I had Elaine track the GPS on your phone, he said, matter of fact. What the hell? Don't just track my phone. We're partners. I'll track your fucking phone if I want to. Not for very long, we're not. You jackass. I'm not. But Jake came forward, grabbed her by the arm and hauled her around to the passenger's side of the Jeep. She dragged her heels across the pavement, squirming a little bit, but his grip was way too strong and he was way too big. She didn't know what she thought she'd do if she got free of him. I finished up at the crime scene and called the station looking for you, he said as he yanked open the car door and shoved her in the passenger seat. When nobody could find you, my instincts told me that it might not be safe out here, so I had Elaine track your phone. I didn't interrupt you. I didn't invade your space. I was going to wait till you were done and then come in. But Martin got to us first. Because there is a murderer out there. Hands off, she said, smacking at his fingers until he let go of her arm. Even though she tucked herself into the passenger side, he stayed at the door, stooping a little to glare in at her. She could practically feel his body heat. He was so close and she wanted to shove him back, but at the same she didn't. Her heart started to race. As if he knew he'd crossed a professional line, he took a step back. She looked up in surprise. His hardened features softened into something like chagrin. I won't hurt you, partner, he said quietly, his rich brown eyes meeting hers. A shiver went through her. She cleared her throat and nodded, not trusting herself to speak. She reached out and grabbed the passenger side door, yanking it shut between them. He stood looking at her through the window for another few seconds before starting around the car. Amanda wasn't entirely sure what she just felt. It was a complicated tangle of emotions that got knotted up in fear and desire and confusion. When he looked at her like that, she saw more than the filthy mouthed asshole who'd shown up that morning, and for a second her fear that he might be the killer fled. But only for a second. And there was something exciting about being manhandled by this big, strong man with a mysterious past and mean spirit. She shook her head a little as Jake climbed into the driver's side. You know where we're going? He asked, voice gruff, as he turned the car on and started to pull out of Benson's parking lot. Amanda fumbled her phone out of her pocket and checked the text from Captain Martin, nodding. Yeah, a pair of hunters found the body in the forest. Captain sent directions. Jake nodded, eyes glued to the road. You navigate then. Amanda pulled her seatbelt on and kept her phone gripped in her hand, willing herself not to look at him as they coasted towards the highway. Chapter 4. Jake didn't know what had come over him. Well, he knew, but he hadn't expected to have that kind of reaction, not for her. The whole thing was really starting to get to him. Months of this, of bouncing from place to place, one killing after another, it was bound to get to anyone, he reasoned. But he had to be more careful. Now he was trapped in his truck for an hour, with the scent of her right next to him, a taste for blood and vengeance on his tongue. Not an ideal situation, but he'd make do as he always did. He'd bottle down all that rage and all those feelings, take it out on a hunt in the forest when this was all over. He wouldn't let his heart get anywhere near Amanda for her sake. The crime scene had given him exactly the same kind of clues that every other crime scene had before it. The same MO, but a different victim in a different town, and no evidence to point him in any new direction. Whoever the killer was, he knew what he was dealing with. More bodies were going to turn up before it was done. Every other time the killer had taken at least 4. He'd gotten brazen in this small town, though, to take 2 less than 24 hours apart. Maybe he thought the counties wouldn't talk to each other. Or maybe he knew that Jake was in town on his heels. Maybe this was a message. Bring it on, motherfucker. Come and get me. Jake would rip the murderer's throat out with his bare teeth when he caught him. Night came upon them quickly as they drove. It was sudden out here, not gradual like it seemed in the cities. The sky blackened all at once and the stars popped out like fireworks, the moon a haloed beacon in the dark sky. Above the highway, the silence between Jake and Amanda was becoming deafening. He could hear her breathing, hear her heart beat as it calmed from the sudden jump it had made earlier. He could smell the gust of mountain wind on her clothes from the bike. He could tell she didn't trust him. He didn't blame her. No one trusted him and he generally preferred it that way.
No. Responsibilities, no baggage.
But for some reason he wanted this smart, beautiful woman to trust him, or at least to look at him without such contempt and suspicion in her eyes. Though Strickland County was an hour away from Prowler's Bluff, they shared the same mountain and the same forest. Though it was out of season, some guys went for a hunt and had stumbled upon the body, then called it in despite their illegal outing because it had scared the shit out of them so bad. By the time Jake and Amanda got to the crime scene after another hike up unpaved trails, both the Strickland County Sheriff's Department and Captain Martin were there. The place was illuminated by standing lights, a whole knot of crime scene investigators milling around in their plastic pants and gloves. The smell of the place was such a mess that Jake was having trouble picking it all apart. Except for the smell of blood that was thick in the air. Who's the victim? Amanda asked Captain Martin when they met at the edge of the scene. The captain shook his head, expression grim. It's a woman. Name's Esther Fisher, mid-50s. Same scene though. Hunters found her face down in the damn foliage, skinned. What was she doing all the way out here? Jake asked. She only lives half a mile away. The captain pointed west. Owns the nearest trading post. You know, hunting equipment. Marv said she mostly kept to herself, no family that anyone knows of. Marv was the Strickland County Sheriff. It was a running joke that he was Marvin and the captain was Martin. They were basically twins, 2 counties away. Sounds like the killer is targeting the same kind of person, at least, Amanda said. Isolated folks living alone with no extended social circle. Captain Martin nodded. Look, I told Marv we'd go halfsies on this. His guys will share whatever info they get, and so will we. Yeah, if we ever get any info at all, Amanda muttered. Then she frowned. Were there any hairs near the body? Like animal hairs? Jake felt his whole body flush. Those damned animal hairs. He still hadn't given them to Tom, and no doubt Amanda knew that. That was stupid. He should have figured out another way around that, and now she was sniffing up his trail. Captain Martin frowned too. I don't know, but I'll ask. I'll make sure they get you the forensic report as soon as they have it. Thanks, Captain. Amanda turned to head towards the crime scene, but Jake heard her phone vibrate. When she pulled it out and looked at it, he saw her face turn pale and heard her heart rate kick up towards a gallop. She turned back to them. Captain, are you heading back to town now? Yeah, I gotta log this in the report system. Could you drop me off at Benson's? Wait just a damn minute, Jake said, scowling in spite of himself. We just got here. You can't leave. We have to check out the scene. I might have a lead. What kind of lead? The sensitive kind who only wants to talk to me. She arched her eyebrows at him, a challenge. So I'll go follow this up and you go check out the crime scene. You seem to want to deal with the last one all by yourself. Jake clenched his jaw, his ire rising. He didn't have an argument though. Beyond no, stay with me, and he knew it. Fine. Just text me when you're headed back to the bluff, Amanda said already, turning to go tromping back towards where the squad cars were parked. I'll fill you in then. And she just walked off. The captain lingered, though, looking at Jake with a strange expression that he eventually realized was sympathy. She'll warm up to you eventually, Captain Martin assured him. Jake snorted. I don't really give a fuck, Captain. I'm just here to get the job done. Captain Martin sighed. That just ain't the right attitude for prowlers. Bluff, son. And it's not the right attitude to work with Amanda. I'm the new guy here, Jake argued. She should be working with me. Captain Martin chuckled and shook his head, turning to head down the trail. You've been the new guy often enough, you don't deserve that kind of treatment anymore, kid. Get your head on straight or that girl will eat you alive. Jake watched him go, thinking just how wrong Captain Martin was on that score. Then he trudged his way through the maze of local cops and CSI equipment, up over a small ridge to where the body had been found. Barry Sims was kneeling in the foliage taking samples, and Jake sniffed at the air, but there were too many people around. He couldn't get anything helpful, which was happening more and more often. Too many people. Not enough evidence. But this was unusual, because the killer had moved away from one town to the next but stayed relatively close. Either he was getting sloppy or just impatient, or there was something about Prowler's Bluff and the surrounding mountain that had caught his attention and held it. Jake suspected they were only going to be finding more bodies in the days to come. He sank down to a crouch beside Barry, taking in the sight of Esther Fisher, face down in the dirt and grass. "Just like Mr. Stanley?" he asked Barry, who was stuffing some of the dirt into a vial for forensic evidence. The slim, baby-faced Barry looked at Jake, blinking a little owlishly in
surprise.
Probably nobody ever talked to him. Medical examiners and their ilk could be hard to talk to, a little cagey and scientifically obsessed, Jake found. Barry sputtered a little, nodding. Yes, he said. Just the same. Skinned alive, Jake presumed. Barry was still nodding. From the amount blood and the state of it, yes, I would say yes, skinned while still alive. What would anyone do that for? Jake wondered aloud, scowling down at the corpse. A pelt. Like a hunter. The killer is taking pelts. But even the hunter kills his quarry first. Barry jittered a little nervously, and Jake figured he'd probably push the young doctor into a role of uncomfortable thoughts. But that's what you had to deal with when you worked a murder scene. There are a lot of hunters in this part of the country, Barry said after a moment. Very popular hunting area. What do they hunt? Jake asked. Deer. Barry shrugged. I'm new to town myself, he said. But I think yes, deer. Perhaps rabbit and hare, mountain lion, black bear. Jake nodded, straightening back up to his feet. And wolf. Barry held up his hands at a loss. I'm sorry, detective, I'm much better with dirt and bugs and things than I am with hunting. Jake nodded. Thanks, Barry. Good work. He didn't need the ME's assistant to confirm it for him. He knew in his bones, he knew that someone was hunting wolves. He'd known since the very first body, of course, years ago. He felt like with every case he got closer and closer to the killer, but never close enough. He was determined to catch up to the killer this time somehow. He would find a way. And then he would let the beast in his heart rip the guy to pieces. As he walked back to his truck, though, his mind kept turning again and again. Back to Amanda. She'd split so fast, without even looking at the crime scene herself. Jake knew she was up to something, but he couldn't begin to guess what. Whatever it was, it had to do with him, though, the way she'd shut him down and gotten a ride back to Prowler's Bluff with Captain Martin. Maybe she was seeing things that Jake could not, being a native of the area. Maybe he'd made a mistake writing her off so quickly, but he knew it was dangerous for him to trust her, and probably even more dangerous for her to trust him. He had a hard enough time keeping control of himself, and whenever she was nearby, the animal inside him wanted to take over, to protect, to dominate, to fight and fuck and hunt. Amanda was just a human woman. She had no hope of surviving him if he got too close. But knowing that did not make him want to get too close to her any less. He'd been on his own too long, he knew. He was not built for this kind of isolation, and it made him at once weaker and more prone to eruptions of power. Not unlike each of the killer's victims, the distance he put between himself and other people made him volatile and yet easier to take down. He had to be careful, to look out for himself, because nobody else would, but it weighed on his heart when he was honest with himself. Those were rare moments. But since he'd met Amanda, they were coming upon him with more irritating frequency. Something about her made him want to reach out, made him want to be close to another person again, even if she was exactly the wrong kind of person he should be reaching for. Chapter 6. Jake's mind was a whirl. He fought with the wolf for dominance, but knew he was losing. She drove off on her motorcycle, and the wolf wanted to give chase, wanted to hunt, but Jake struggled to turn away from the highway and launch himself into a gallop towards the woods at the edge of the motel parking lot. He thought if he could run the wolf out, he might be able to shift back without all the rage of the dissatisfied beast swollen in his heart. Then he would find Amanda and try to explain. He had to at least try to explain. Didn't he? Her scent was still all over him, all over the motel and the motel parking lot, and Jake ran through the forest trying to forget it, to chase it away with dirt and forest and the night sky. But it was no use. Both he and his wolf couldn't stop thinking about her. The softness of her skin and the warmth of her body, the quiet cries she made when Jake was inside her. He wanted to turn back, to run her down and either rip her apart or fuck her senseless, but he fought every impulse that had to do with her. He thought about trying to run right out of Prowler's Bluff to just leave town and never return as he had done so many times before. But he was so close to catching the killer. Closer, he thought, than he had ever been before. Yes, that was why he wouldn't leave. It had nothing to do with Amanda. Amanda was a distraction, an obstacle, one that Jake would have to get around. Somehow. He shouldn't have fucked her, but her body called to his, and even the wolf couldn't fight that off forever. He'd known, though, deep in his bones. He'd known that he would change, that he couldn't control it. Sometimes he got really sick of being fucking right. He couldn't run as hard and as long as he would have liked, hindered by the higher elevation that he wasn't used to. Too quickly, the wind started to thin in his lungs and the wolf's muscles began to burn, and he had to slow down. But it was enough that the beast had begun to calm, and the rage and lust in his mind ebbed. He started to be able to take in the sights and sounds and smells of the forest around him. He was only a few miles from the highway, but the mountain was thick with wildlife. The woods were calmer, the animals and insects and trees alive and growing all around him. The night birds were singing above his head. He heard an owl screech in the distance, another predator on the hunt. Then he caught the unmistakable scent of other wolves. First he simply passed it by. He knew there was a local pack on the mountain. He chased them away from Stanley's front yard for Amanda's sake. But a second whiff gave him pause, and he doubled back to investigate a little further. The trail led back toward the highway, back down the mountain towards town. Jake stopped again when he sensed the tang of his own kind in the scent. Not just normal wolves. Then, not just an average mountain predator. They were accompanied by at least 2 shifters, and Jake did not recognize their scents. Nobody he'd ever met before. Perhaps he'd finally caught the scent of the killer, and thoughts of Amanda fled his mind as the wolf's rage flared up again, overwhelming everything else. He tipped up his head and let out a furious, echoing howl, then barreled off to track the scents back to Prowler's Bluff. Chapter 7. Amanda heard the wolf's howl ringing in her ears long after the roar of the wind outside her helmet should have silenced it. It was like the sound pierced right into her heart and burrowed there, twisting her into knots. She couldn't shake the image from her head of Jake doubling over and then turning into a giant fucking wolf. It was unreal. It was impossible. But she'd seen it with her own eyes. She'd watched it happen. She was well past trying to tell herself she'd been dreaming. She'd fucking seen it. She'd fucking fucked it. Jake Hunter was the big bad wolf. Literally. And she had no idea what to do about it. A part of her wanted to go home and get out her rifle, hunt him down like the monster he was, and shoot him right between the canine eyes. But another part of her remembered him on his hands and knees on the floor begging her to run, and she wasn't so sure that he was all monster. She wondered if he still knew her after he changed, if the wolf was just a wolf or if there were pieces of Jake left inside it. Was this how he'd gotten rid of the wolf pack at Stanley so quickly? Did he speak wolf? Did wolves have a speech? As she thought about it on the drive back to her apartment, she knew she was teetering perilously close to confirming for herself that she was insane. No, she couldn't be insane. She'd seen it. Whatever it was, whatever it meant. She'd seen it. Him. She'd seen him turn into it. After they'd had sex. That part was almost harder for her to reconcile than the wolf part. Amanda didn't just do that. She didn't know what had come over her. There was something about Jake, and now she was afraid that it was the wolf, that he'd had some kind of supernatural hold on her. Sure, she was attracted to him before, but she'd never, ever have slept with him, never have just gotten on her knees for him. But she had, and she'd liked it until she'd thought maybe he wasn't such a huge asshole after all, until he'd started to change. Now she just didn't know what the hell he was or what he could ever be to her, if anything. There was still a murderer loose in the area, and Jake was connected, and Amanda had no leads at all. This was turning into a hell of week. She liked to think of herself as practical and problem-solving, but all she could do was drive herself home. All she wanted to do was crawl into bed and hide there for the rest of her life. Not particularly heroic, but even Amanda could only take so much before it all began to overwhelm her. Skinned bodies and hot guys turning into wolves all in the same week would have been too much for anyone. She got to her apartment in record time, mostly because she completely ignored all of the speed limit laws. Her motorcycle could book it when she wanted it to. Amanda had never been so happy to see her apartment building's brightly lit parking lot. Her unit, of course, was around on the other side of the building, an external staircase leading right up to her front door, but she decided to park right under one of the lights on the highway side. With her helmet tucked in the crook of her arm, she walked into the shadow of the building and around to the staircase. By the time she actually made it into her apartment, her whole body was tight as a bowstring with tension, and she'd given herself a headache from clenching her teeth. She put her helmet on the little table by the door, hooking her keys onto the keyring in the hall, and turned on lights as she made her way through the little apartment. After her parents died, Amanda never returned to the house she grew up in. She'd been 17, abruptly orphaned, with no extended family to speak of, and nowhere to go. There had been talk of sending her to some foster family somewhere, but she hadn't wanted to leave Prowler's Bluff, so Captain Martin himself had taken her in. When it came to the house, half destroyed by the flood, the captain had let her decide what to do about it. She'd inherited the land and the small sum of her parents' savings. She could rebuild the house if she wanted, but she didn't. She told him to have it demolished. Every year after that, she considered selling the plot of land, taking the money and going to school or on a trip, but she never did. She just let it sit there on the mountain, a big bruise that still had not healed, while she lived in her little apartment and did her best not to think about it. She preferred the smaller space anyway, especially tonight. She could see all the corners and there were precious few shadows, though normally the dark did not frighten her. She poured herself a giant glass of red wine and drew a bath, made sure all the windows and doors were locked, and climbed into the tub to try and relax. It didn't work. Every time she closed her eyes she saw Jake, either in the enticing naked way or the terrifying wolfy way. Instead of being the proper kind of bathtub sensual inspiration, it ended up leaving her hot and bothered, and still totally terrified. Too quickly, she abandoned the wine for her phone and spiraled into a mad Google hole of keyword searches like werewolf and werewolf sex and turning into a werewolf through sex and giant wolves in Colorado and how to tell if your partner is a werewolf. None of these provided her with any actual answers, although a few of them did inspire her to get out of the tub, go into her room and dig up her mother's old, tarnished, heavy silver cross pendant. She put it on and climbed back into the tub, but by then the water was getting tepid and her phone's battery was dying. She got back out with the heavy pendant dangling down into the valley between her breasts, drained the tub, plugged in her phone and refilled her glass of wine. She was 3 glasses in when she started to feel better about it all. She began to calm down and think a little less rationally. Cozy on her sofa in her yoga pants and t-shirt, warmed by the wine in her veins, she reconsidered this whole werewolf thing and managed to get very, very close to convincing herself that she'd imagined it all, that what she'd seen had not, in fact, been what she'd seen. She was just confused. Maybe he'd been full of shit, faking it to get rid of her after the sex, and she was a complete idiot who totally fell for it. That was clearly what had happened, and Jake was not a werewolf, just an asshole. Latching firmly onto that scenario, she decided to stop drinking the wine and stop thinking about Jake Hunter, and instead go up to the station to go through the evidence again on the murders. Solving this case would not help her wounded pride or her loneliness, but it would make her feel less like a useless sack that nobody wanted. At least she'd be a useless sack that nobody wanted who could solve crime. This plan was only just starting to unravel in her mind as she pulled her boots on over her yoga pants and shuffled down the corridor to her helmet and keys. Any other day, she would have known better than to even consider getting on her bike after a few glasses of wine, but this was an extraordinary day and these were extraordinary circumstances. She made it out the door and onto the landing, then stopped, looking down at the shadowy stretch of parking lot over the landing's railing. It was not as empty as it had been when she'd gotten home. In fact, it was quite crowded with wolves. Amanda froze, clutching at her helmet, looking down at them. They were all looking back up at her, a dozen golden eyes flickering, reflecting eerily in the wan light from the rest of the parking lot. They were just standing there, all of them staring at her. The wine more or less evaporated right out of her, sobering her up in an instant. She felt for her sidearm, not that she could have shot all of them if they decided to attack her at once, and they must have been there to attack her, the entire fucking pack of wolves. Heart in her throat, she took a step back from the railing towards her
Apartment door.
A chorus of growling stopped her from taking a second step back. She went still again, and as she watched, the wolves started moving. Some of them drew closer to the building and some of them moved, flanking her, and then she realized one exceptionally large wolf was headed for the stairs. The wolf was so large that she couldn't help but think of Jake. Amanda was starting to think that these were no normal wolves. Normal wolves did not lie in wait outside a person's apartment like this, that was for sure. She took another step back towards her apartment, and the largest wolf at the bottom of the stairs bared its teeth at her in a vicious snarl. It was all smoky gray with a few patches here and there of white fur, and Amanda got the distinct impression that if she took another step to flee, it was going to lunge up the stairs at her. At the same moment that she thought about taking a chance to escape them, the pack began to snarl and snap, and there was an eruption of shuffling and yelping as a new wolf bounded in. Amanda realized with a gasp that it was the big black wolf. Jake. The gray wolf turned from the stairs and dove into the fray, and Amanda couldn't see what was happening in the shadows beneath the railing, but she heard enough to know that the pack was piling on the new wolf. She bolted to her apartment door and shoved through it, slamming it at her back and turning the lock as fast as she could. Then she stood there, her back to the door, and waited, listening to the horrible sounds from Chapter 8. Jake had followed the scents of the pack right to Amanda's front door. When he'd realized it, the wolf had overtaken his brain in a fury. He couldn't help himself when he saw them all gathered outside her apartment. In a haze of dominant, possessive madness, he tore into them, all flashing fangs and snapping jaws. They snapped back, but he realized most of them were normal wolves themselves, not shifters, and he could easily overpower them. Quickly, they started to back up and flee, leaving only 4 larger wolves for him to contend with, all of whom were human as well. One of them stepped to the fore, dark gray and white, and Jake knew this must have been their pack leader. If he simply killed this wolf, he could have claimed the pack for himself and become their alpha, but that had never been something he wanted. Still, he wasn't about to die here or let them take Amanda. The gray wolf bared his fangs and Jake bared his back, but he didn't advance. It was a delicate dance, that of 2 alphas facing off, and Jake had been in this position before. He knew he had to be careful or the blood fight would be on, and then there would be no turning back. So without breaking eye contact with the gray wolf, he took a single step back. Not enough to express submission, but enough to break the fight for dominance they were headed towards. It was enough. After another moment, the gray wolf took a step back as well, ceasing his snarling. The regular wolves he kept in his pack had all fled into the woods. At the edge of the property, Jake got a grip on his wolf, on the animal still bristling in his heart, and bowed his head as he summoned the change, at last calm enough to actually pull his man's skin to the surface again. His felt his bones crunch and reconnect, his fur fading and his senses dulling. As his body shifted from beast to man, he ended crouched on the grass across from the remaining members of the shifter pack, and then straightened up to his feet, running his hands back through his hair as he breathed through the last tremors of the shift. He shook himself, naked and a bit chilled by the desert night air. "She is protected by me," he told the gray wolf. The gray wolf bared his fangs again, and then Jake watched him shift, shrinking down and then straightening up in his man's skin. He was gray-haired as well, with a strong jaw and piercing green eyes. His expression was grim as he folded his arms across his bare chest. "There have been murders," he said. "Murders of our people. We think she's connected." "No way." Jake shook his head. "She's a cop, she's my partner. I came here looking for the killer. I've been following him across the country for years." "Why do you think Amanda's involved?" "Her scent in the woods." The man scowled. "And yours?" "Can't avoid that, we have to investigate." Jake glanced at the front door of Amanda's apartment again, then looked back to the pack alpha. "My name is Jake Hunter. I was a member of the Chicago pack, you can check up on me. I vouch for her. She's not the killer." "Killers?" The alpha arched an eyebrow. "More than one. We caught the scents just after, but not in time to identify who they belonged to. They were here and gone again with speed. We came here to see if your Amanda was one of the ones we smelled." "More than one." Jake nodded. He'd thought maybe, but then couldn't be sure. He frowned. "I don't want trouble with you, man. I want what you want." My name is Alistair. I will let this unfortunate encounter pass, but don't get in our way. He turned away, walking on bare feet towards the tree line, and the other 3 wolves fell in, following and flanking him. Jake started to ask him to wait, to ask him more questions, but he knew better than to try and strike up conversation with the pissed-off alpha. The guy would need to cool off before he could have a chat without wanting to rip Jake's throat out. Just another one of the continuous struggles of being a lone wolf in a pack-oriented world. He let them go. Once he was sure they were well and truly gone, he turned again to look up at Amanda's apartment. With a sigh and a frustrated grit of his teeth, he headed up the stairs and knocked on the door. Amanda, it's me. We have to